can't have Warhammer without chaos. I don't care if you're talking about fantasy. I don't care if you're talking about 40k. Chaos is central to the Warhammer motif. Anyway, there are lots of different ways that chaos can manifest in the 40k universe in terms of different things that show up in the various types of games and stories and everything. For Dark Heresy, there are multiple chaotic factors that can come into play in a game, but I'm going to talk about a few of them and focus mostly on how it pertains to something like an RPG like Dark Heresy, not so much if you're playing miniature battles and stuff like that, because obviously if you have something like traitor regiments of the Imperial Guard that have gone over to Chaos, that's going to be more relevant to a big military game than an RPG in most cases. All right, so chaos comes from the warp. The warp is, of course, where the ships move through to go faster than light. Essentially, they warp out of real space into the immaterium, and then they warp back into real space when they've navigated to where they think they need to be. It's not a perfect process, but anyway, all that is where chaos basically comes from. And you've got things like demons, and you've got things like chaos gods. Your classic Khorne, Slaanesh, Tzeentch, and of course Nurgle. And all that comes from there. Now, what happens is there are various ways that chaos can get into the real world. You can have things like warp rifts, like the Eye of Terror, which I'll talk about a little more later. You can have things like crazy cultists who worship the chaos gods doing rituals to summon chaotic powers like demons and stuff like that. And you can have just, things that have been corrupted by chaos but are actually part of the real space, the real universe, and that includes things like the Chaos Space Marines, who may have become corrupted, other chaos races, mutants in some cases, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Right, mutants. Okay, mutants, unlike in Warhammer Fantasy, are not always chaos mutants. First of all, there's a lot of variation through all the various planets and worlds, so there can be variations on the theme of what they refer to as the perfection of the human form. The Imperium is incredibly xenophobic. It does not sanction any aliens, but there has to be a little bit of latitude of what's considered actually human. On one planet, it may be a distinct coloration of hair or skin. It may be that the particular populace over the years has evolved to be unusually tall or short or something like that. You also have what are referred to as abhumans, which are sort of a stable mutation, and these are things like the Ogryn, which are kind of like ogres. But anyway, the point being, all that is not necessarily a mutant. And you can even have people who have gotten mutations because of environmental factors like radiation and industrial chemicals and things like that. And these, sometimes referred to disparagingly as twists, are mutants, but they're not chaos mutants. And mutants of any type are best as second-class citizens, sometimes even considered property. But you can also have warp-touched chaos mutants. And things like the Inquisition are always interested in mutant populations because regardless of why they're mutated, the way they're relegated to this shunted to the side kind of a thing, they're just a breeding ground for possible heresy and traitorous thoughts and things like that. So they're always keeping an eye on that. So that's sort of what goes on with mutants. Now, in most cases, I will also say it's less mutant powers like X-Men and more things like you have a tentacle instead of an arm, sort of a thing. So, mutants. Okay, you also have the cultists, which I mentioned, and they're worshipping the various dark powers. They may have their own agendas. They may just be led astray and they don't realize that some sort of chaos cult has secretly inserted heretical teachings into what they thought was the proper worship of the God Emperor, and sometimes this can happen over generations. This is why the ecclesiarchy is always very, very worried about checking up on this sort of thing, because a little cell gets into the right place within the priesthood and they can corrupt an entire world. It's a big problem. It's something they worry a lot about. So this is also something that the Inquisition is really worried about: heretical teachings, heretical cells, and this isn't always even chaos. This can also be cells that are in league with Xenos races, which Xenos will be a separate video. But just so you understand. So you have your classic cultists. Okay, last you have the forces of chaos, which this gets a little bit farther afield from when you're talking about things that you might deal with in the Inquisition, because when you get into this, you're talking about things like Chaos Space Marines and stuff like that. And now you're getting more into that military level where it's unlikely that a cell of acolytes is going to be trying to deal with a company of Chaos Space Marines, because they'll get their keister kicked. Now, they might uncover them. They might be part of the investigation. Quickly summed up the Chaos Space Marines back during the Horus Heresy, which I talked about in the first video. These are the traitor legions which left to go with Horus and rebelled against the Empire. They're still around. They're still causing trouble. And some of them mutated. Some of them, if they've done really well at being horrible chaos things, have actually been quote-unquote promoted into being demons and demon princes. So they are a definite problem, but just in terms of their raw numbers, it's not like there are billions of them running around. So it's unlikely, just as it's unlikely for a normal person in the Imperium to ever see a real Space Marine, it's even less likely that they'll ever see a Chaos Space Marine. But they do exist, and they do actively still work towards the downfall of the Empire. So that's chaos. In a nutshell, nice and quick. There's a lot more to it, but the fact is that's what you more or less need to understand about how it works in 40k to deal with it in Dark Heresy. And the rest you find out as you play. Okay, that's it for now.